All right, good morning, everyone. Hopefully, everyone should be done with the reading quiz by now. Looks like, at least from the scores I saw coming in, everyone looked like they were doing pretty well with it. So today we're going to continue the presentation on corridors. And so I'm going to jump right into that. Let me just get my screen reshared here. All right, let's get rid of this. All right, everyone see that? Good. All right. So if you recall from last time, sorry, let me fix this. We were talking about some of the characteristics of corridors, and specifically we're looking at riparian corridors and some of the benefits they provide and some of the characteristics that allow them to function optimally. And so the next thing we're going to look at is corridor connectivity. And since corridor connectivity is such an important aspect of the function of corridors, we're going to take a little time to better understand some of the issues surrounding this. So we'll take a look at some different corridor types with a focus on the habitat connectivity that each one provides. We're going to start with corridors providing the greatest level of connectivity and then work our way down. So starting at the top, the best option for connectivity when looking at corridors is naturally going to have wide continuous corridors. These present the fewest barriers to species movement. They provide protection from predators in the surrounding matrix. They allow for more or less unimpeded organism and gene transfer between connected patches and allow for long-term viability of populations, communities, and ecosystems. Studies have shown that in places where large individual patches are unavailable, biodiversity and population viability is almost equivalent to that ideal when a series of smaller patches connected by wide continuous corridors are available. Straighter corridors are also preferred as they reduce the distance that needs to be traveled when moving from one resource patch to another. So that's kind of the ideal, is to have the most direct route of travel and for it to be wide enough that provides protection to the species they're using it from, edge influences, and also to provide the resources that they need as they're traveling from one patch to another. Less preferable is the next type, which is a corridor with nodes. These corridors have some portions that are sufficiently wide with other areas that are eroded or narrower. The coves are created by this erosion of the corridor or places of vulnerability for prey animals that are moving through the corridor, because obviously those prey animals now are closer to the edges and therefore more likely to be predated by predators that are in the matrix. As we've seen previously, the undulating edge condition of these corridors increase the amount of edge effect and limit the proportion of core habitat in the corridor. So just like we looked at with patches, corridors also have a core habitat if they're sufficiently wide. And a corridor with nodes is going to be eroded in places where it minimizes or even eliminates the amount of core habitat in that corridor. In addition, the highly curvilinear edge makes it more likely that invasive species and other deleterious factors can penetrate the corridor and inhibit species movement along its length, right? So in these diagrams, what we're seeing is in the white is the core habitat, and then in the gray are the areas where the edge effects are present, where you're going to have other species nearby, and you're not going to have, or rather other species are inhabiting that edge condition, and it's not going to be as favorable for the species that are adapted to the core habitat. Right, and you can see here along this corridor, there's a few places where the corridor is narrow enough that it's entirely edged essentially without any core habitat. And so obviously that's going to be a little bit less preferable for the interior species than if it's just a nice wide corridor. The next type of corridor we have are stepping stones, and these can be thought of as isolated mini patches. Animals have to cross through limited amounts of matrix, obviously, in order to reach each stepping stone. But these periodic points of refuge are helpful as the animals are moving from one main patch to another. But overall passage through this type of environment becomes much more risky, and fewer individuals are likely to attempt or survive the journey. Right? So in this case, you have much more exposure because the animals are having to cross portions of open matrix in order to get to each of those stepping stones. That said, however, this is still preferable to having no corridor connectivity at all between patches. And then obviously the worst option for connectivity is to have no corridor at all. So in this case, animals will still try to cross the landscape mosaic sometimes to find the resources that they need to survive, but only under extreme circumstances. And those that do venture out are at elevated risk of predation or simply not being able to find the resources that they need to complete the journey. Right. So in this case, we can see a landscape mosaic. On the left is one patch, on the right side is another, and the animals don't really have a viable corridor to use to move from one to the other. And so they're just crossing through areas of the matrix that are not, comfortable in terms of being part of their habitat or places where they can find resources. And two patches that are separated in this manner have a much higher likelihood of localized extinction or population loss. So one way to think about corridors is to imagine being on a hike and needing to cross a stream that's known to contain flesh-eating bacteria, right? So you're out on a hike with some friends and you have to get across a stream. You're not guaranteed to be infected if you get wet, but staying dry is by far going to be your best choice. And no, skipping the hike is not an option. So you have to move through this environment and you have to cross the stream. So in this situation, which of the crossings would you want to choose, right? You have a wide bridge that's going to be pretty easy and not have much challenge to it. Very little chance of getting wet and getting eaten by the flesh-eating bacteria. A log bridge is similar to a corridor with nodes where, it's a little bit riskier. You might fall off, but it's still better than having to cross the stream without a corridor. And then you have stepping stones, a little bit more risky, right? A little bit higher chance that you might fall in. And then finally wading across, which is the equivalent of the landscape mosaic, where you're just going for it and taking your chances and hoping for the best. And so that's kind of one way to think about these corridors in terms of how wildlife that are looking to move from one patch to another are basically experiencing these corridors and sort of the risk assessment that's involved in choosing to move through a corridor. And since gaps in corridors have such an impact on connectivity, it's important to consider the nature of those gaps and the impacts on specific species. The top three diagrams here show the relationship between the distance over which an organism typically ranges and the length of gap that can be traversed. So animals with larger scale movement behavior will be able to traverse larger gaps in the corridor than those with shorter range movements. And then the two bottom diagrams show the importance of the nature of the surrounding matrix. If the difference in vegetative composition and structure between the corridor and the matrix is low contrast, species will obviously be able to traverse longer gaps in the corridor than they would in a high contrast setting, because that matrix is more similar to the habitat that they're accustomed to. And likewise, the distance and relationship between stepping stones in a discontinuous corridor is particularly important for highly visually oriented species, such as many bird and cat species, which will typically only move out of an area of relative safety if they can see the next stepping stone or patch that they're headed for. And so, so for those species, that's a really important part of whether or not they're going to, take that risk and how they're going to make that risk assessment of wanting to move to that next patch or stepping stone in the corridor. So in planning terms, this means that islands of vegetation must be considered holistically within the overall mosaic. They can't be considered as individual elements within the landscape. A seemingly small and insignificant patch of wooded land may actually be a critical stepping stone for some species, and the loss of that stepping stone would inhibit the movement of that species, endangering the population viability of the patches that are connected by those stepping stones, right? So in this example, we have a diagram that's showing two large habitat patches with some smaller stepping stones connecting them. And it may seem like this one in the middle is pretty small and insignificant by itself, but again, you have to look at it within the larger context to understand the role that's potentially serving, and not just make a decision that it's okay to get rid of that patch because it's by itself, it's relatively small and insignificant. And of course, the optimal arrangement of stepping stones in locations where a continuous corridor is not viable is to have more or less a field of stepping stones that provide numerous possible pathways for organisms to get from one patch to another. So the greater the variety of pathways available, the more resilient the network will be in the event that one of those stepping stones is lost. So when you have lots of these smaller stepping stones, they're creating a field that allows for essentially a network for organisms to pass through, so that if for some reason it's too dangerous to move from one patch to another, they have multiple options of how to get through that network to access the resources in the larger patches on either side. And so in many ways, corridors offer the greatest hope for repairing some of the damage that's been done by human development patterns. They're far easier to integrate into our cities and towns than large patches, and they provide many benefits for humans as well, such as shading and windbreaks, noise attenuation, and so forth. And indeed, entire networks of corridor plantings like these hedgerows that we see in a photo from some agricultural fields in northern Germany have long been implemented for these purposes and have only been recognized for their ecological function over the past 50 years or so. And we're going to be talking a little bit more about some of the planning implications of landscape ecology and corridors and how all of these different pieces fit together in the next week, or well, actually we'll really be talking about that after the next exam, which is a week from Thursday, of course. All right, so that concludes the lecture on corridors. Again, I'm sorry how I had this kind of, for several lectures now, I've had like this little piece hanging off the end that had to be finished up on the next class meeting. But does anyone have any questions about what we covered with corridors? Great. The last thing I wanted to do is to just open up ArcGIS here. I'm going to share that with you. So here we have an example of some tree locations. In this case, it's City Park, but in Fort Collins instead of in Denver. And ArcGIS has a number of tools available. I'm not actually going to have you guys work through any of these because they're a little bit more complicated, and they actually just take more processing time than what I wanted to sit through in class. So I just prepared a set of some different examples of how ArcGIS is used in finding and assessing habitat corridors. And so in this example, the first thing I wanted to show you guys is that when you have a set of data for trees, like we have in this example, in this case, these are not polygons, they're points that are showing the locations of individual trees within City Park. And I've put these together I've isolated them on a layer called City Park Trees. And if I open up the attribute table for that, actually, hold on a second here. If you guys, just in case you wanted to play around with some of this data, let me go into Canvas here. And it's not really an assignment, but if you go here, I just shared under activities, I shared something called activity 2. And all that's in there is basically the download for the City Park Trees zip file that you can extract and open up in ArcGIS if you'd like to kind of play around with some of this data. But some of what I wanted to show you that's often included when you have tree data like this, unfortunately, is included with the Fort Collins tree data, is that in addition to the names of the trees and the genus and species and all kinds of information about them, one piece of information they have here is measured DBH. Does anybody know what DBH stands for? Surely somebody here has taken a horticulture class that mentioned DBH. Nobody. All right, so DBH stands for diameter at breast height. So essentially it is the diameter of the trunk of that tree. This is specific to trees. It's the diameter of the trunk at a point about 4 feet off the ground. And this is used as sort of a shorthand for estimating the sizes of trees by measuring how wide the trunk is. And you can see some of the values here are 1. In this case, this is in inches. So the ones with 1s are like very small, they're like basically a little more than seedlings at this point. But as we go down the list here, I just have them sorted in order. You can see the measured DBH gets up to 25 inches, 26 inches, and the largest one in City Park, let's see how big that is. 78 inches and that's a cottonwood, right? So that's a pretty big trunk right there. And while it's not a perfect measure of the tree's canopy, it can be a good indicator of the relative canopy size of those trees. And one of the things that you can do if you're trying to get an estimate of the canopy, because oftentimes that's a more useful measure of where those corridors or patches are going to be, as opposed to where the actual trunks land. We can do that. Let's close that. We can do that using a buffer. So we looked at buffer a little bit when we were doing the chipmunk exercise in GIS. And so if I come up here and I open up my buffer tool, move this thing out of the way. And sorry, I have a couple of windows open here I need to close. There we go. So here under input features, I'm going to put in my city park. Well, actually, before we do this, let's add a field that represents the size of the tree canopy. So if I right click on city park trees, I go back into my attribute table, and this is similar to some of the stuff that we did in the chipmunk example. Same process essentially, but I'm going to use DBH as a proxy for the spread of the canopy and use it to come up with a canopy measure. So what I'm going to do here is I'm going to add a field. And I'll call this field, I'll just call it canopy diameter. And we'll make the type a double. Actually, it doesn't even need to be a double because it's just going to be an integer. So I'll just make that a short instead. It's going to be numeric. And I'll just hit OK for that. And then we want to save that change. So I can click save at the top or just close the fields window and it'll ask me to save it. So if I just close that, it'll ask me to save the changes. I'll say yes. And so now all the way at the right side here of our table, we should have a field called canopy diameter. And in fact, they had already, you know, the city, when they were putting this together, they had crown spread, which is basically the same thing, but they never filled it in. It's just all zeros. So that's not very helpful. So we're going to use the DBH as a proxy for that. So I'm going to right click on canopy diameter and I'm going to choose to calculate field. And that lets me do a calculation based on other information that's available in the table. So in this case, I'm calculating canopy diameter. And I'm going to, instead of Python 3, let's make this Arcade. Those are just programming languages, basically, but you don't need to know much. Just need to know basic math, essentially. So what we want to do is take the measured DBH, which is filled in, and then we're going to multiply that by, let's say, 12. Whoops. Right. So what that means is that for every inch of DBH of the diameter at breast height, it's going to have 1 foot of canopy. So something with a 78-inch spread, sorry, a 78-inch DBH is going to have about a 78-foot spread. Something with a 1-inch trunk is going to have about a 1 foot spread because it's a very small tree. And so that's a good way. Obviously, again, this changes with the species and the type of plant it is, whether it's columnar or it's weeping or whatever the form may be. But this is a good way of approximating what that canopy spread may be. So once I have that all entered, I can click OK. And it's going to go through now. It's just going to automatically fill in for each of these. It's looking at the DBH, multiplying it by 12, and filling in the answer under canopy diameter. Right, and so you can see here now it's filled in those canopy diameters. And so now I can close this window. And I'll go to my analysis tab and I'm going to run my buffer tool. And so in this case, my input is going to be city park trees. I can just drag that over. And then it says the distance, it says instead of linear unit, I can drop that down and say I want to use a field to indicate what the buffer distance is going to be. So I'll use field. And then we'll drop this down, choose which field. In this case, it's going to be the last one, which is canopy diameter, the one we just created. I'll leave this on planar. Again, whenever you're calculating anything that has to do with distances or areas, it'll always give you a choice between geodesic and planar. Planar is going to be much faster because it just assumes the ground is flat. when you do geodesic, it's taking the topography into account, and it takes like 1,000 times longer to calculate. So unless you really need to know, to that level of specificity, I almost always leave it on planar. And then under dissolve type, I can have it automatically dissolve together those tree canopies, right? So if I choose to dissolve features using fields, unique values, or combination of values, and I just leave that blank, it'll just take any of the trees that are overlapping with each other and automatically dissolve them together so that they're creating one continuous canopy. Also, I have to give my output feature class a name. I'll call it City Park Trees Canopy. Oops. And now we'll go ahead and I'll run this. And it runs fairly quickly. That can't be right. That's way too big. I'm thinking it took what I put in as inches and thought that they were feet. So that's no good. Let's try that again. So I'm going to, well, if they're feet and we did an equivalent of converting by 1 inch equals 1 foot, I can just use the DBH as my tree canopy. So let's try that again. I'm going to get rid of this one. Let's just remove that. Let's do this buffer again. So we're going to use City Park Trees as the input feature. The output will be, I will call this canopy feet. And instead of linear unit, will be field. This time, let's just choose the DBH since it's looking at them as if they're feet instead of inches. Leave the method as planar. Okay, let's run that one. This one should look a lot better. There we go. That looks a lot better, right? So if I turn off my City Park Trees now, and it always does this, it doesn't do, for some reason, oh, I chose no dissolve, that's why. So we can just do it in another step if we want here for the tools. Dissolve. Bring in that canopy. Call this canopy dissolved. All right, let's run that. And as long as you're not choosing any fields, it'll just dissolve them based on their overlap. There we go, that's better. So now they're dissolved and got rid of all the lines in between. So now this is creating, it gives you a much better sense of what that actual, what the patches look like or where there may be corridors available that the different species are using to travel along those potential networks. So that's one thing I wanted to show you guys. Another thing I wanted to show you, let's turn that off, is that there's also an ability to create, that one's a little blurry, I won't use that one, so we'll use this one. You can have it assess the distances between each of the trees. In this case, it was using the actual tree locations, the tree trunks. But what this does is it helps to visualize what the distances are from essentially from stepping stone to stepping stone. If you're thinking about species moving through this and using corridors, where areas in red are, and it gives you all sorts of settings that you can use in terms of determining like what is the maximum distance that you want to look at that a species would be willing to move. And so anything that's red or just open is kind of at, the red is at the very limit of how far a species will move from one stepping stone to another. And then these open areas are places that they just won't cross or that they'll cross only at great risk. And so part of why I wanted to show here is that it's just a good way of visualizing where some of that connectivity is in the landscape, and makes it a little bit easier to see like what those connections are and what the relationships are. So for example, we can see that a species that's traveling through here, there's actually, it's kind of at the maximum distance that they might want to move, but they can still cross over and continue along their way or over this way as well. And it gives you a better sense of what that network is that connects together all of those, the different patches and what's creating the corridors that they can move through. Obviously, species who might move down this way, they kind of come to a dead end because the distances become too great to traverse to get back to a resource patch. This is also useful for showing how street trees are really useful for a useful connector and corridor type that humans create for reasons of aesthetics, but which also provide those benefits for species that are trying to move through this network. So, we can see that species might have the option to move up here and have really good connectivity with the other trees that are down here in this portion of the park, in addition to being able to move through the park itself. So this tool is just a good way of visualizing some of those relationships. And you can also use this to create, let me turn that off. I'll turn my trees back on. And I also created, it'll look at basically, here, let's actually turn the trees off. It'll look at creating, I think these are selected. Let me deselect those. There we go. It'll also look at creating potential movements and networks through all of those different points that you have collected. So in this case, it's trying to find like the most efficient ways of moving between two different points. And it measures the level of risk that you can color code here. So they refer to it as path cost. And actually this tool was developed to figure out the routes that you could use for shipping goods, for example, and try to figure out the most efficient path to get from one point to another. But we can also use this as a tool in landscape ecology to find the sort of least risky ways for wildlife to move through the landscape. And this case is taking those trees and creating these networks where greens are low cost or low risk ways of moving through the landscape, and yellows and oranges are higher risk. And so it looks at different ways of being able to move through that landscape by looking at it as a complete network. So these are some of the different types of tools that we can use in GIS, and we'll be looking at this in a little bit more detail with some examples after the next exam, which is going to be, again, 1 week from Thursday on April 1st. So I just wanted to show you a few of those examples, but otherwise we are going to end it there today. Let me stop my screen share. And I would like you to know that we are not having class on Thursday. Instead, I have posted a film on Canvas under modules that's called Division Street. And it's it's sort of an independent film that looks at habitat connectivity and corridors, and specifically the impact that roads have had on fragmentation of the landscape and some of the efforts that are underway to try to fix some of those issues that roads have created, especially highways. And actually one of the people featured in that film is Richard Foreman, who was my professor of landscape ecology when I was in graduate school. So it's, for me at least, it was like fun to see him in the film. But it's kind of a good overview of some of the issues that that planners are thinking about in terms of how to deal with network connectivity and bridging some of the gaps that are created by the fragmentation created by roadways. You need to log in to your CSU account. It's hosted on Canopy, this particular film. So you can log in just using your CSU user ID and password. and watch that film at your leisure anytime you want. But keep in mind that the content in that film is fair game for the exam next Thursday. So I would recommend taking some notes on it while you're watching the film, just to help you kind of recall some of the major themes that are discussed in that film. So that's really basically it for this week. Next Tuesday, we'll be doing another review before exam number 2. Then you have the exam on Thursday, and then we'll move on with new content the following week. So any questions before we wrap it up for today? I will take that as a no. So have a good one. Enjoy the film, and I will see you guys next Tuesday.
Thank you, Scott.
Thank you.